A soldier sits in a trench. His hands shake uncontrollably. He hasn't slept in days. When he closes his eyes, he sees the faces of the men who died. He hears sounds that aren't there. Explosions, screaming, the sounds of death. Sometimes he forgets where he is. Sometimes he forgets who he is. The doctors have a name for this: shell shock, or combat neurosis, or war neurosis, or soldier's heart. But the names don't matter. What matters is that something has broken inside this soldier. Something psychological, something neurological, something that won't heal with conventional medicine. Shell shock was one of the great mysteries of World War I. Millions of soldiers returned home with it. But nobody understood it. Nobody knew how to treat it. Nobody even acknowledged it was real. Doctors argued about whether shell shock was real or imaginary, whether it was neurological or psychological, whether it was cowardice or injury. The debate raged for decades, but the soldiers who suffered knew the truth. Shell shock was devastatingly real, and its effects lasted lifetimes. Today we're going to explore 15 effects of shell shock, 15 ways that World War I destroyed the minds of soldiers. The truth is psychological. The truth is neurological. The truth is deeply human. If you're interested in the psychological consequences of war, the real stories of soldiers, and how history shaped our understanding of trauma, make sure to subscribe to Surprising. Every week we explore the untold stories of war, the human cost of conflict, and the psychological scars that last generations. Subscribe now so you don't miss the most compelling historical content on the platform. And turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now, let's begin our exploration of shell shock. Reason 15, tremors and uncontrolled movements. The body that won't listen. One of the most visible effects of shell shock was physical tremors. Soldiers' hands would shake, sometimes so violently they couldn't hold a cup of water. Some soldiers would experience tics, uncontrolled movements of the face, jerking movements of the limbs. Some soldiers would experience paralysis, sudden inability to move. The legs would simply stop working. But doctors examining these soldiers could find nothing wrong physically. No nerve damage, no muscular damage, no injury. The tremors and paralysis were real, but they weren't caused by physical injury. They were caused by psychological trauma expressing itself through the body. The nervous system had been so damaged by exposure to trauma that it couldn't function normally. The brain couldn't send proper signals to the body, or the body couldn't receive the signals. The result was that soldiers' bodies betrayed them, betrayed their will, betrayed their attempts to function normally. A soldier who wanted to walk couldn't walk, wanted to hold something couldn't hold it. The disconnect between mind and body was profound and devastating. Reason 14, sleep disturbance and nightmares. Never truly resting again. Sleep became torture for soldiers with shell shock. They couldn't sleep, or they would sleep for brief moments and then wake in terror. When they did sleep, nightmares consumed them. They would dream of the trenches, of dying men, of explosions, of gas attacks. The nightmares were vivid, detailed, realistic. A soldier would wake screaming, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, completely disoriented. They didn't know if they were in the trench or at home, didn't know if the danger was real or imagined. The sleep deprivation compounded the other effects of shell shock. Without sleep, soldiers couldn't think clearly, couldn't regulate emotions, couldn't function normally. Prolonged sleep deprivation itself creates psychological symptoms, adds to the neurological damage. Soldiers would sometimes go for weeks without real sleep, just fragmented, nightmarish unconsciousness. Reason 13, anxiety and panic attacks. Fear that has no rational basis. Soldiers developed intense anxiety that could appear without warning. A sound would trigger panic, a sudden movement, a smell. The anxiety would hit like a physical blow, heart racing, breathing rapid, sweating profuse. The soldier would be convinced that danger was imminent. Even in complete safety, a soldier sitting in his house would suddenly believe that artillery was attacking, would dive for cover, would grab a weapon, would prepare for combat, all based on a false perception of danger. The anxiety was overwhelming, all-consuming, impossible to control through will or reason. A soldier could know, intellectually, that he was safe, but emotionally, psychologically, his body was reacting to perceived mortal danger. Panic attacks would last minutes or hours, leaving the soldier exhausted afterward. Some soldiers would have multiple panic attacks per day. The constant state of anxiety was itself traumatic. The body remained in fight-or-flight mode perpetually. Reason 12. Emotional numbing and detachment. The inability to feel. Other soldiers experienced the opposite problem, the inability to feel anything. They would return home and feel nothing. No joy, no sadness, no anger, no love. They could see their wives and feel nothing, could hold their children and feel nothing. The world seemed gray, meaningless, empty. This emotional numbing was a psychological defense mechanism. The brain had been exposed to so much trauma that it shut down emotionally, but the cost was devastating. A man who couldn't feel anything, couldn't function in normal life, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't enjoy activities, couldn't care about anything. Some soldiers described it as being dead while still alive, still breathing, still moving, but not truly living. The emotional numbness could last for years, could persist for the entire life of the soldier. Some soldiers never recovered their ability to feel normal emotions. Reason 11. Hypervigilance and startle response. Always watching for danger. Soldiers developed an exaggerated startle response. A sudden noise would cause extreme reaction. The soldier would jump, would grab a weapon, would prepare for combat. This was the body's adaptive response to wartime. In the trenches, sudden sounds could mean enemy attack. Sudden sounds could mean danger. The body developed an instantaneous response to threat. But in civilian life, this response was maladaptive. A door slamming would cause the soldier to dive for cover. A car backfiring would cause the soldier to run for safety. The startle response was involuntary, couldn't be controlled through conscious effort. Soldiers remained in a state of hypervigilance, always watching, always listening, always prepared for attack. The nervous system never fully transitioned from wartime to peacetime. The soldier was effectively still in the trenches, in his mind, in his body, in his nervous system. Reason 10. Memory problems and dissociation. Memories that won't stay away. Some soldiers developed problems with memory. Couldn't remember simple things, names, dates, events. But other soldiers had the opposite problem. Couldn't forget anything. The memories wouldn't leave. Traumatic memories would intrude constantly. Flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, unwanted recollection. A soldier would be doing something ordinary and suddenly be back in the trench, back in combat. The sensory experience was complete. Could see, could hear, could smell, could feel the sensations. This was dissociation. The mind was effectively reliving the trauma. Some soldiers would lose time entirely, would come to consciousness hours later with no memory of the intervening time, would find themselves in different places, without knowing how they got there. The memory problems made it impossible to function normally. A soldier couldn't maintain a job that required remembering details, couldn't maintain relationships that required remembering shared experiences. Reason 9. Irritability and explosive anger. The rage that can't be controlled. Many soldiers returned from the war with explosive anger. Small things would trigger rage. A comment, a look, a minor inconvenience. The soldier would explode with violence that was completely disproportionate to the situation. A wife would say something innocent. The soldier would become enraged, would shout, sometimes would become physically violent. A child would make a noise. The soldier would react with anger that terrified the child. The irritability was constant. The soldier was walking around with a powder keg inside, ready to explode. The rage was often directed at loved ones, at people the soldier cared about most. The result was that families lived in fear. Wives and children never knew what would trigger the next outburst. Children grew up in homes where their father was unpredictable, potentially dangerous. The explosive anger isolated soldiers from their families, destroyed relationships. Reason 8. Depression and suicidal ideation. The darkness that won't lift. Many shell shock victims developed severe depression. The world seemed hopeless. The future seemed meaningless. Life seemed not worth living. Suicidal thoughts became constant companions. Some soldiers would think about suicide dozens of times per day. Some soldiers made suicide attempts. Some succeeded. The suicide rate among soldiers with shell shock was horrifyingly high. The depression was resistant to treatment, resisted to everything. No amount of encouragement or support could lift it. The soldier felt trapped. Trapped in a body and mind that wouldn't work right. trapped in memories that wouldn't leave, trapped in anxiety that wouldn't diminish. Some soldiers felt so desperate that they welcomed death, thought that suicide was preferable to living with shell shock. Reason 7. Speech problems and mutism. The words won't come. Some soldiers developed speech problems after shell shock. They would stutter severely. The words wouldn't come. Severe stutter that made communication nearly impossible. Other soldiers would lose the ability to speak entirely, would become mute. The mutism wasn't caused by physical damage. The vocal cords worked fine, but the connection between mind and speech had been severed. A soldier could understand what people said, but couldn't speak in response. Some soldiers would regain speech. Others would remain mute for years or life. The inability to communicate added to the isolation, added to the depression. A man who couldn't speak was effectively isolated from society, couldn't work, couldn't maintain relationships. Reason 6. Sexual dysfunction and intimacy problems. The private trauma. Many soldiers with shell shock developed sexual dysfunction. Some experienced erectile dysfunction. The body wouldn't cooperate, couldn't achieve sexual arousal. Some experienced complete loss of sexual desire, no interest in intimacy. Some experienced the opposite, uncontrolled sexual thoughts, intrusive thoughts about sex that couldn't be suppressed. The sexual problems added to the strain on marriages. Wives didn't understand why their husbands couldn't be intimate. The soldiers felt shame, felt that they were failing as husbands, failing as men. The sexual dysfunction was a symptom of the deeper trauma. The body was failing to respond to anything. Reason 5. Alcohol and drug abuse. Self-medication for unbearable pain. Many soldiers turned to alcohol and drugs to cope with shell shock. Alcohol numbed the pain, numbed the anxiety, allowed sleep. Soldiers would drink heavily. Some would become alcoholics. Some would use morphine or other drugs, developed addictions. The substance abuse provided temporary relief, but permanent damage. Soldiers traded one problem for another, traded psychological trauma for addiction. Many soldiers died from alcohol-related complications, liver disease, accidents while drunk. Some soldiers would drink themselves to death, consciously or unconsciously trying to escape the pain of shell shock. The medical community recognized that alcohol and drug abuse were products of shell shock, but did little to prevent or treat them. Reason 4. Occupational dysfunction. Unable to work. Soldiers with shell shock couldn't maintain employment. A job required concentration, required emotional stability, required reliability. Soldiers with shell shock were none of those things. They would start a job, then a panic attack would hit. They would flee, or they would become angry at a supervisor, would storm off the job, or they would be unable to sleep the night before and would call in sick. Repeatedly, many soldiers couldn't work at all, were permanently disabled by shell shock. They would receive pensions, would be dependent on government support for life. The inability to work meant the inability to support a family, meant poverty, meant loss of dignity. Reason 3. Social isolation and relationship breakdown. Alone in a crowd. Soldiers with shell shock couldn't function socially. They would withdraw from friends, from family, from society. A soldier would sit in a room full of people and feel completely alone, unable to participate in conversation, unable to enjoy social interaction. Marriages broke down. Soldiers couldn't be the husbands their wives needed, couldn't be the fathers their children needed. Friendships ended. Former friends didn't know how to relate to the changed person. The soldier had come back from the war fundamentally altered. The people he knew before the war didn't recognize him. The social isolation added to the depression, made everything worse. Reason 2. Physical health decline. The mind destroying the body. The psychological effects of shell shock expressed themselves as physical illness. High blood pressure, heart disease, digestive problems, chronic pain. The constant state of stress was destroying the body. The immune system was compromised. Soldiers got sick more frequently, recovered more slowly. Some soldiers developed what would now be called chronic pain syndrome. Pain without clear physical cause. The pain was real, but caused by psychological trauma, expressing itself through the body. Medical doctors of the time had no way to treat this, didn't even understand it. They would run tests, would find nothing physically wrong, would conclude the patient was malingering. But the pain was destroying the soldier's ability to function. Reason 1. The permanent neurological changes. The brain was actually damaged. Modern neuroscience has revealed that shell shock involved actual neurological changes. Repeated trauma changes the brain, changes the size of the amygdala, changes the hippocampus, changes how the brain processes threat, changes how the brain processes memory. The soldiers weren't imagining the effects. Their brains had been literally altered by trauma. The neurological changes could persist for life. Could be permanent. Some soldiers would recover. The brain would gradually rewire itself. Neuroplasticity would allow healing. But other soldiers would remain damaged neurologically for the rest of their lives. The trauma had inscribed itself in their neural circuits.